The pills that could kill a nation. It began not with a bang, but with silence. A warehouse on the outskirts of Albuquerque. A stack of rusted shipping containers. No alarms, no shouting. Just the heavy breath of DEA agents moving through shadows. Gloved hands sweeping for traps. Pistols drawn, but fingers steady. Under the cold light of dawn, they opened a crate and found death stacked like bricks, pill after pill, blue chalky stamped with fake markings mimicking OxyContin, harmless at a glance, but every single one of them laced with fentanyl, an opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. There were millions of them, 3 million to be exact. Enough to kill an entire nation. Nearby in a second stash house, agents found ghost guns, untraceable firearms assembled without serial numbers, along with over $600,000 in cash cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. In a third location, they found silence. A man sitting calmly, hands clasped, watching them as if he had been expecting this moment for years. His name was Heriberto Salazar Amaya, or at least that was the name the paperwork used. He said nothing when they cuffed him, nothing when they read the charges, not even when they told him what they'd found, because he already knew. The bust sent shockwaves through the country. Fentanyl had already claimed tens of thousands of American lives. But this was something else. The largest pill seizure in DEA history. A fully operational multi-state network dismantled in a single morning. 16 people in custody. And at the center of it all, a man with no known address, no clear past, and no traceable identity. The news cycle went into overdrive. DEA's biggest win yet. Cartel takedown in the desert. But behind the headlines, the real story was still unfolding. Who was this man? Where did the pills come from? And how many more shipments had already made it through? The American opioid crisis had long since passed the point of statistics. Now it was personal. Parents finding their kids unresponsive in suburban bedrooms. First responders collapsing from contact with airborne powder. Hospitals overwhelmed with overdose cases that traditional treatments couldn't handle. And now 3 million more pills, each one a potential death sentence intercepted just in time. Or maybe too late. This wasn't just a bust. It was a puzzle. A trail of couriers, safe houses, burner phones, and encrypted messages. It was a web of loyalty, fear, and silence. And at its center was a man no one really knew. The story doesn't start with him. Not exactly. But to understand how the DEA got here, how fentanyl became the drug of choice for Mexican cartels, how synthetic opioids replaced poppy fields, how pills became weapons, you have to go back to the root, to the why. Because every pill has a path, and every path has a face. Tonight, we follow that path. From the labs in Mexico to the streets of Oregon. From suburban kitchens to cartel compounds. From the dead to the living. From the known to the unknown. This is the crime trail. And this is the story of the 3 million pills that could have killed a nation. Thank you for following this crime-solving journey. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the Crime Trail channel so you don't miss out on upcoming exciting stories. An unseen flood. Fentanyl's American invasion. The rise of fentanyl in America wasn't a sudden wave. It was a slow, relentless flood. And by the time most people realized what was happening, it had already seeped into every neighborhood, every age group, every corner of the country. In the early 2000s, opioid addiction in the United States had a different face. OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet brand names handed out in neat bottles from suburban pharmacies, prescribed for back pain, post-surgery discomfort, and the unspoken pain of modern life. It was the era of legitimate pain relief, and few questioned it. Until the overdoses began. As regulations tightened and doctors became more cautious, patients addicted to prescription opioids started to turn elsewhere. Heroin filled that gap, cheaper, stronger, easier to find. But even that soon lost ground to something deadlier: fentanyl, a synthetic opioid originally developed to treat severe cancer pain. In hospitals, it was a precise tool. On the streets, it became chaos in a capsule. Cartels, especially in Mexico, were quick to recognize the shift. Fentanyl didn't require vast poppy fields or careful harvest seasons. It could be made in a lab, faster, cheaper, stronger. A kilogram of fentanyl cost a fraction of heroin to produce, yet yielded exponentially more doses. And profit. But with great potency came great risk. A miscalculation of mere milligrams could mean death. For dealers who didn't care, and buyers who didn't know the result was catastrophic. One pill could kill, and often did. At first, the pills were disguised, pressed to look like prescription oxycodone or Xanax stamped with familiar markings. They were sold on Snapchat in high school parking lots and gas station bathrooms. Many users didn't even know they were taking fentanyl until it was too late. By 2020, the CDC was reporting over 100,000 drug overdose deaths annually, the majority synthetic opioids. Fentanyl. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. Seizures increased, but so did deaths. For every shipment stopped, another slipped through. The border became a front line. So did Middle America. It wasn't just a war on drugs anymore. It was a war on invisibility. Unlike cocaine or heroin, fentanyl didn't have a smell. It didn't need bulky packages. A few grams could be hidden in a book, a shoe sole, a car battery. Some smugglers dissolved it in liquid only to reconstitute it later. Others baked it into fake candy wrappers or stuffed it inside children's toys. Detection became a nightmare. A single overdose could trigger a county-wide panic. Police departments issued warnings to officers not to touch powder directly. Schools ran drills. Parents carried Narcan, an emergency antidote like an EpiPen. The cartels adapted faster than the systems trying to stop them. They built micro-networks using low-level distributors who didn't know the full picture. Payments were routed through cryptocurrency. Dead drops replaced hand-to-hand transactions. Social media became the new corner block, and through it all, someone had to be directing the flow. Someone had to be calculating the shipments, laundering the money, building the routes, recruiting the couriers. Not with a gun in hand, but with a phone, a contact list, a memory built on silence. In New Mexico, fentanyl overdoses surged by 74% between 2022 and 2024. Albuquerque, once known more for its desert beauty and breaking bad myths, was now a fentanyl hot zone. Hospitals reported spikes in cases among teens, veterans, even infants. And somewhere in that rising tide, Heriberto Salazar Amaya had found his foothold. He didn't invent the fentanyl trade, but he understood it. He saw that fear was a tool, that chaos created cover, that in a crisis the most valuable weapon wasn't a gun, it was control. By the time DEA started tracing the pills, the damage had already been done. Too many bodies, too many grieving families. Too many I thought it was just one pill stories. This wasn't just about supply and demand anymore. It was about survival on both sides of the law. And so the agents dug deeper, into the deaths, into the pills, into the networks that seemed too clean, too quiet, too smooth to be coincidence. Because fentanyl wasn't just in the streets now, it was in the blood of a country, and someone had opened the floodgates. Heriberto Salazar Amaya didn't exist on paper, not really. No tax records, no verified address, no social security number. His name appeared only in fragments, a prior deportation order here, an intercepted alias there, a blurred ID used once to register a car in Oregon. And yet when DEA agents finally arrested him on April 28th, 2025, they knew without question they had their man. He was the ghost they'd been chasing for over a year. The orchestrator of a fentanyl pipeline that ran through 6 states, the invisible hand moving pills, money, and weapons with terrifying efficiency. And still, when they looked into his eyes in that dimly lit safe house in Albuquerque, he didn't flinch. No anger, no fear. Just a quiet, unreadable calm. To understand Heriberto, you have to understand what he wasn't. He wasn't flamboyant. No gold chains, no Instagram flashes of cash or weapons. He didn't operate from flashy mansions in Sinaloa. He lived in motels rented under fake names, ate at diners, drove used cars. He blended in not by accident, but by design. His story began as best authorities could trace in northern Mexico. Born sometime in the late 1980s or early 1990s, though no birth certificate has ever been verified, he crossed into the U.S. as a teenager undocumented, worked odd jobs in construction and agriculture, twice deported, once in 2010, again in 2012. Each time he came back. Each time he stayed longer. Somewhere between 2015 and 2018, he disappeared from public record entirely. By the time he resurfaced, Heriberto was no longer a laborer. He was a facilitator, a broker of supply, not the kind who bragged or threatened, but the kind who never made the same mistake twice. His power didn't come from violence, but from absence. He never showed up in person unless he had to. He didn't carry phones. He issued instructions through layers of cutouts, each one just close enough to believe they worked for him, but far enough that none of them could point directly to the top. Even inside his own organization, people weren't sure what to call him. Some said El Niebla, the fog. Others referred to him simply as El Patron, though never out loud. He cultivated an image not of grandeur, but of myth. Stories passed in whispers. The man who never blinked. The one who once escaped a raid by walking out the front door dressed as a pastor. To law enforcement, he was a nightmare. Too clean, too careful, too quiet. And yet the signs were there. A string of overdoses in New Mexico, all traced back to pills, with a distinctive blue hue and irregular pressings. An Oregon license plate spotted near multiple drop-off zones. A motel clerk who remembered a quiet man who paid cash and never left trash behind. A storage unit leased in Utah under a fake name, but paid for every month in person. The DEA knew they weren't chasing a street-level dealer. They were chasing an operator. One who understood not just drugs, but systems, supply chains, logistics, psychology. Heriberto didn't threaten people. He didn't have to. Everyone around him understood that silence meant survival, that loyalty was non-negotiable, that those who spoke disappeared. And still, for all his control, his downfall came from something simple: predictability. Even ghosts, it turns out, need habits. He returned to Albuquerque every few weeks. Always stayed near the interstate, always checked into places with no cameras, always paid in cash. But the DEA was watching, quietly, patiently, waiting not for him to slip, but for the net to tighten just enough that escape was no longer possible. When they finally moved in, he was sitting on the edge of a motel bed, watching a muted television, a half-eaten takeout container beside him. He looked up, saw the agents, and didn't say a word, because Heriberto knew. The pills had been seized. The stash houses were gone. The lieutenants were in handcuffs. The operation, months, maybe years in the making, had collapsed in one morning. But for a man who had built an empire on silence, defeat didn't look like fear. It looked like stillness. Heriberto Salazar Amaya didn't build his empire overnight. Like all intricate machines, it started with one moving part: a route, a shipment, a test of trust. And from there, it expanded with surgical precision. By the time the DEA mapped it out, his fentanyl distribution network touched 6 states: New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Oregon, and Colorado. It wasn't just the breadth that stunned investigators. It was the elegance of the system. Each link in the chain served a specific role, compartmentalized and disposable. The couriers never knew the stash house locations. The stash house keepers never met the suppliers, and only a handful ever heard Heriberto's voice. At the top, he was the conductor of a silent orchestra. The pills arrived in bulk, sometimes hidden inside used electronics, shipped from Mexico, sometimes vacuum-sealed inside industrial-grade paint buckets. The quality varied, but one detail remained constant: pale blue tablets stamped M30, mimicking pharmaceutical oxycodone. They entered through Arizona and New Mexico. The desert, vast and unmonitored in places, made for ideal staging grounds. From there, shipments moved north, either by car or commercial freight camouflaged among legitimate goods. One courier delivered auto parts. Another transported medical supplies, all legal on paper, all lethal underneath. Every state had a purpose. New Mexico was the hub. Oregon the outer edge. Utah offered quiet, middle-class suburbs with storage units no one questioned. Colorado and Nevada were distribution points. Arizona was the artery from the border. And in each state, Heriberto placed a handler. They weren't career criminals. Most were naturalized citizens, middle-aged men with clean records and side businesses, vape shops, tire dealerships, cleaning services. They laundered money, leased vehicles, rented drop houses. To neighbors, they seemed unremarkable. To Heriberto, they were pawns, useful, expendable, replaceable. He maintained order not through brutality but through design. No texts, no emails, no paperwork. Instructions were passed in person or through coded phrases. Payments were never discussed directly. Couriers were given sealed envelopes, GPS coordinates, and a time window. If they deviated even slightly, they were cut out. Not killed, just erased from the system. Forgotten. It was efficiency through fear, and it worked. Between late 2023 and early 2025, fentanyl overdoses in counties surrounding Albuquerque rose by over 70%. The DEA suspected a new supplier, but couldn't trace the pills. They lacked the usual indicators: no signature cuts, no custom stamps. Only that familiar pale blue color, and one irregular flaw, a microscopic indentation on the pill's edge. It was a mistake. In the press, a manufacturing defect that unintentionally became a clue. That indentation led to a raid in Nevada, where 12,000 pills were seized in a vacant apartment. From there, agents followed a series of short-term vehicle rentals, storage unit logins, and ATM withdrawals. It was like following a ghost. But ghosts leave traces, even if faint. By February 2025, a DEA task force had charted nearly 40 vehicle movements between New Mexico and Oregon. None of the drivers had records. None of the cars were owned under real names. But the patterns were undeniable. Like spokes on a wheel, all roads pointed back to Albuquerque. What fascinated investigators most was how Heriberto handled pressure. While rival suppliers made mistakes, flashy purchases, arrogant posts, sloppy laundering, he remained invisible. No large wire transfers, no suspicious luxury assets. His money was cleaned through dozens of low-volume businesses and cash-heavy industries. Food trucks, dog groomers, mobile tire repair crews, a layer of grime over everything. He understood one thing better than most violence attracted attention, but routine. Routine made you disappear. His couriers were trained to act like shift workers. No late-night deliveries, no high-speed runs. Just men and women in modest cars, obeying traffic laws, stopping for coffee, making scheduled deliveries like anyone else. It was this very normalcy that delayed the investigation for so long. DEA agents began to doubt they were even chasing a cartel-connected operation. Could this be the work of a mid-level cell, a rogue distributor? Or was the scope far bigger than they imagined? They would get their answer soon. But in those final weeks before the takedown, Heriberto moved differently. Fewer visits to New Mexico, more reliance on lieutenants. The system once tight began to stretch. Some handlers grew sloppy. Some couriers took risks. And the DEA was watching. The net was closing thread by thread. But Heriberto didn't see it, or maybe he didn't care, because for 2 years he'd outwitted everyone. For 2 years he'd turned 6 states into a silent corridor of death, and he believed until the very end that ghosts couldn't be caught. In the world, Heriberto built silence wasn't merely strategy, it was survival. Loyalty was rewarded not with money, not with status, but with invisibility. And to betray that silence was to disappear not in a blaze of violence, but in the quietest way possible. One day, you were part of the system. The next, your phone stopped ringing. No explanations, no warnings, just gone. The people who worked for Heriberto understood this implicitly. They didn't need rules carved in stone. They learned by watching, by listening to what was left unsaid. His inner circle was small, almost minimalist. A handful of men and women, most in their 30s and 40s. Some had criminal records, old ones buried under new names. Others had none. One had once been a school bus mechanic. Another managed a landscaping crew. Each was chosen not for skill, but for temperament. Calm, reliable, invisible. They were never told everything. Each only knew their piece of the puzzle, where to meet, what package to move, when to show up, who to avoid. They didn't ask questions. Questions were dangerous. The couriers were even less connected. Many were paid in cash after a single run and never called again. If they were smart, they never knew what they had delivered. If they were lucky, they never found out what it cost. One woman later arrested in Oregon said she'd been hired to drive a cooler full of what she believed were frozen tamales. Another claimed he was delivering automotive parts from a warehouse in Mesa, Arizona, to a repair shop in Salt Lake City. Neither ever met Heriberto. Neither had more than a burner phone number. But the package's fentanyl. Thousands of pills concealed so carefully they slipped past 3 routine traffic stops. At the top, Heriberto communicated through layers, his orders relayed in person, through handwritten notes that were destroyed immediately after reading. Nothing digital, no calls, no texts. Even when a transaction required multiple states and several people, he never deviated from the method. The closest anyone came to hearing his voice was through El Gato, his most trusted lieutenant, a man who appeared in DEA files as little more than a nickname and a partial license plate number. El Gato acted as Heriberto's shadow-booking travel sourcing pill presses, delivering final instructions. But even he remained partially in the dark. Heriberto didn't confide. He directed. The silence extended beyond the people. The places they used, stash houses, storage units, motel rooms, were stripped of personality. No photos, no names, no receipts. When DEA agents raided a storage unit in Utah, they found 30,000 pills hidden inside hollowed-out dog food containers. No fingerprints, no traceable labels, just dust and precision. And when people failed, when they made mistakes, Heriberto's response was surgical. One handler in Nevada, suspected of skimming product, was simply removed. Not killed, just cut off. His phone stopped working. His login credentials were void. The next time he tried to make contact, no one answered. A month later, he was arrested in a routine traffic stop. No backup, no story, no one to call. That was Heriberto's power. He didn't need fear to maintain loyalty. He used isolation. Every person in his network believed they were replaceable. Every person knew they were being watched. Every person understood speak and you vanish. Not in a body bag, in paperwork, in memory. But cracks were forming. By early 2025, some couriers had begun taking risks, speeding, deviating from routes, texting family while on a run. One even posted a photo to social media with the caption, "Road Trip Grind." DEA flagged it within hours. The photo showed the edge of a package in the back seat, slightly unzipped. The operation, once tight as a drum, was loosening. Whether due to overconfidence, complacency, or scale, Heriberto's invisible empire was showing signs of wear. And that's all it took, because the DEA wasn't just watching routes anymore. They were watching people, their habits, their hesitations, their silences. They understood that fear could be cracked, that enough pressure applied precisely could make even the most loyal subordinate speak. And so they waited. For the first flinch, the first late reply, the first courier who broke the code of silence. They wouldn't have to wait long. It began with a slip, a late-night vehicle seen exiting a warehouse in Bernalillo County just outside Albuquerque. The warehouse had no signage, no public access, and yet every few days a different vehicle arrived, stayed for less than 15 minutes, then left with a cooler or duffel bag in the trunk. Unremarkable, almost forgettable, but not to Agent Dana Kessler. She'd been with the DEA for 12 years, long enough to know that real danger often hides in the routine. One nondescript van. One plate that didn't belong to any registered business. It was enough. By February 2025, surveillance teams were quietly deployed around the property. Cameras disguised as birdhouses, motion sensors along the rear fence, aerial drones that tracked vehicle movements from hundreds of feet up. Nothing overt, nothing to tip the hand. And what they began to see was a pattern. A method. Every delivery was made by a different person, always in a different vehicle. Some wore work uniforms, some dressed like rideshare drivers. Each entered through a side entrance with a keypad, each left alone. For weeks, the DEA didn't act. They observed, logged plates, traced rental histories, built timelines. Then they went further. They followed the couriers. One led them to a storage unit in Salt Lake City, rented under a fake name, paid in cash. Another to a suburban home in Las Vegas, where packages were moved into a van labeled as a pet grooming service. From there, pills were passed to other hands, smaller networks, street-level dealers who didn't know or care where the pills came from. They only knew they sold fast. This was the ecosystem Heriberto had designed, an organic, multi-layered distribution model with no clear command center. But even the most cautious organisms leave residue. In March 2025, DEA analysts noticed 2 vehicles, both with out-of-state plates, visiting the Albuquerque warehouse within the same 48-hour window. Both had also made trips to Oregon and Utah within the previous 2 weeks. Coincidence was unlikely. They decided it was time to move closer. Agents planted GPS trackers on the vehicles. Nothing fancy, just small magnetic beacons hidden under wheel wells. They ran cold encrypted data dumps to avoid detection. And what they revealed was stunning. Both vehicles were making circular routes, Albuquerque to Phoenix, to Las Vegas, to Portland, then back. Each stop lasted just long enough for a handoff. Each route followed by another vehicle within 24 hours. They weren't random. They were choreographed. And the more they traced, the more they returned to one name, Heriberto. But finding him was another matter. He didn't own property. He didn't sign leases. He didn't drive cars registered in his name. In fact, the only image they had of him came from a blurred motel lobby camera in Oregon taken 2 years prior. He wasn't a ghost in the supernatural sense. He was a ghost of bureaucracy, unclaimed, unverified, operating in the cracks. So the DEA changed tactics. They stopped chasing the pills. They started chasing the cash. Fentanyl was cheap to make, expensive to buy. The profit margins were astronomical. Somewhere that money had to land, and it did through a network of cash-heavy businesses spread across 6 states. Vape shops, car washes, landscaping crews that never mowed a lawn. All showed suspicious income spikes over the same 18-month period. All paid taxes. All had no online presence. One particularly telling thread emerged in Oregon, a mobile windshield repair service that received over $400,000 in cash deposits in just 7 months. The business was a shell, but the man listed as its owner. He had once shared a P.O. box with a woman known to rent motel rooms for Heriberto under a false ID. It was the first real break. Surveillance shifted. That woman, real name Carla Nunez, became the new focus. She wasn't a high-level player. She didn't handle drugs or money, but she moved in Heriberto's orbit, and she was tired. Tired of moving, tired of waiting, tired of the silence. Agents moved in quietly. A visit disguised as a parking citation inquiry. A casual question about her employer. A slow build-up of pressure. She didn't confess, not directly. But she confirmed one thing: Heriberto always stayed within 15 minutes of the warehouse, always near an on-ramp, always for less than a week. That was all they needed. On April 26th, unmarked units began rotating through every motel near the I-25 corridor in Albuquerque. They checked registries, they watched parking lots, and in a modest room at a rundown property on 2nd Street they saw him. Gray hoodie, old jeans, sandals, a man eating instant noodles and watching static on a cheap television. He had been there for 2 nights, paid cash, left no ID. The next morning, the DEA secured a federal warrant. April 28th, 5:37 a.m. They knocked once, then entered, and Heriberto Salazar Amaya, 2-time deportee ghost operator mastermind of the largest fentanyl pill network in DEA history, looked up from his cup of noodles and said nothing, because the game for now was over. The takedown, April 28th, 2025. It started before the sun came up. By 4:00 a.m., teams were already in place across 5 states. DEA field agents, U.S. Marshals, local SWAT units, all moving in a rhythm that had been rehearsed for weeks, but would only be performed once. Each team had a list. Each list had names, addresses, and precise time codes. Everything depended on timing. Hit too early and phones would ring. Hit too late and targets would vanish. It had to happen all at once. At 4:17 a.m., radio silence ended. The first team moved on a suburban home outside Salt Lake City. Inside, a handler named Victor Peña was asleep next to his girlfriend. They broke down the door, secured the room, found 2 Glock pistols under the mattress, and 18,000 fentanyl pills hidden inside vacuum-sealed protein powder tubs. At 4:22 a.m., another team entered a duplex in East Las Vegas. No resistance. Just a single man in a tank top, hands already raised. In the kitchen drawer, a list of drop locations. In the bedroom closet, $210,000 in rubber-banded stacks. By 4:30, 10 locations had been hit. By 4:45, 12. And at exactly 5:37 a.m., a DEA tactical unit entered room 26 of the Sierra Pines Motel in Albuquerque. Heriberto didn't run. He didn't speak. Didn't move toward the weapon hidden beneath the sink. He simply raised his hands. Calm. Almost relieved. The arrest was quiet. No shouts. No struggle. He was cuffed, read his rights, and walked out past the neon vacancy sign as morning broke over the desert horizon. The DEA had done it. 16 arrests, 6 states, over 3 million fentanyl pills seized, dozens of ghost guns, over $500,000 in cash, and the top operator at the center of it all taken without a single shot fired. The press release went live at 9:12 a.m. that same morning. DEA executes largest fentanyl pill seizure in U.S. history. Within hours, news networks flooded the story across screens. Photos of blue pills stacked like poker chips, a map showing the 6-state operation, and a single grainy mugshot of Heriberto, expressionless eyes, half-lidded as if still caught between sleep and surrender. But while headlines screamed victory inside the command center, Agent Dana Kessler wasn't celebrating because she knew this wasn't the end. The seizures were massive: 396 kilograms of pills, 11.5 kilograms of fentanyl powder. But it was just what hadn't yet been moved. How many pills had already reached the streets? How many had already been swallowed, crushed, or injected? And Heriberto, even in handcuffs, still hadn't spoken a word. At the Albuquerque field office, interrogation began just after noon. 2 agents, a translator, a recorder on the table. He was read his rights again, offered water, asked simple questions. He said nothing. They tried strategy, compassion, confrontation, showed him photos of the overdoses linked to his pills, told him about the 13-year-old in Tucson, the father in Portland, the teenager in Boulder who died on prom night. Still nothing. Not anger, not guilt, just silence. Outside the room, agents processed the others. 4 confessed immediately, low-level couriers with no idea how deep the network ran. They offered names, routes, payment methods. They described codes, drop times. One even cried. Said he only did it because his mother's cancer treatment bills had drowned them in debt. Another courier, Carla Nunez, the motel runner, turned state's as witness within 48 hours. Her testimony would later be sealed. She identified stash houses, fake businesses, and people who hadn't yet been on the radar. But Heriberto, he kept staring at the floor. Back at the storage units, agents were still uncovering evidence. A pill press in Flagstaff, a ledger in Denver, a freezer truck in Reno modified with false walls, and buried in one New Mexico property, a shallow pit filled with charred cell phones, smashed SIM cards, and burned papers. The scope of the case grew with every hour. Federal prosecutors filed charges that afternoon: conspiracy to distribute a controlled substance possession with intent to distribute use of a firearm in furtherance of drug trafficking; conspiracy to launder money; illegal re-entry after deportation. 12 counts in total. Each carried potential decades in federal prison. Combined a life sentence. But justice isn't swift, and the legal machine moves with caution. Heriberto was denied bail. His attorneys filed motions to suppress evidence. Prosecutors filed requests for protective custody for their witnesses. A preliminary hearing was scheduled, but the trial would take months, possibly a year. And still the pills remained, in evidence rooms, on crime scene photos, in the memories of families who lost children to tablets stamped with fake pharmaceutical logos, who buried loved ones because one pill, just one, was enough to end everything. The DEA had dismantled a network, but the damage had already been done. In the sterile confines of the federal holding facility, beneath flickering fluorescent lights and the constant buzz of surveillance cameras, Heriberto Salazar Amaya sat in silence, day after day, hour after hour. Questions came, questions went. He answered none. His silence was not arrogance, it was discipline. Federal agents rotated through the interview room, each with a different approach. Some tried empathy. "We know you didn't want those kids to die." Others tried leverage, "Cooperate and we'll talk to the judge." A few tried raw confrontation. "You're done, Heriberto. We have everything." But each time his eyes drifted down, to the table, to his fingers, to the nothingness in between. Outside that room, the other defendants were cracking, slowly. One courier, a 22-year-old from Oregon, named Daniel Mercer, confessed to 3 deliveries between Salt Lake City and Albuquerque. He described the process in detail: pick up a locked duffel bag from a storage unit, drive 12 hours, leave it in a motel room under a pseudonym, and wait for a text confirming pickup. He never met Heriberto, but he remembered the man who gave him the first package. "He never smiled," Mercer said, "but I knew better than to ask questions." Then came the breakthrough. A man in his early 40s, previously identified only as Ricardo D., had been arrested in a parallel raid in Phoenix. He had remained tight-lipped during booking, but after a tense phone call with his brother monitored under court order, he asked to speak with a federal attorney. And then he talked. Ricardo was a mid-tier handler, not high enough to know everything, but close enough to feel Heriberto's gravity. He described a meeting, one that had taken place in a diner in southern Arizona 6 months earlier. Heriberto had arrived in a rusted-out pickup, sat at a corner booth, and said 10 words. "You never saw me. You never heard me. You earn." Ricardo said those words were the only ones Heriberto ever spoke to him directly. Everything else came through intermediaries. But in those 10 words he understood the rules: obedience, invisibility, and silence. It wasn't just fear. It was respect. Heriberto had created a code that made his network resilient. No one knew everything. Each person knew just enough to function, but not enough to destroy the whole. Still, cracks had formed. Ricardo provided drop locations, phone numbers, burner phone schedules, and even a partial list of false business fronts used to launder cash. It was the largest information dump the DEA had received since the takedown, and it all pointed to one central hub, the Sierra Pines Motel in Albuquerque Room 26, where Heriberto had stayed off and on for over a year. They had his movements, his habits, his rotations, but they still didn't have his voice. Every lawyer appointed to Heriberto tried the same tactic plea deal. They advised him to negotiate, to acknowledge the facts, to protect himself, and each time he refused. It frustrated everyone, prosecutors, agents, even judges, because silence in the face of overwhelming evidence was a tactic in itself. By not speaking, Heriberto denied them closure, denied them the catharsis of confession, denied them a villain who would explain himself. Instead, he stared forward, sometimes blinking, sometimes not. They moved him into segregation after an altercation in the common area. Another inmate had approached him seeking recognition, maybe allegiance. Heriberto had ignored him. The man pushed. Heriberto didn't react, didn't fight back. But the moment passed and both were separated. In isolation, he was even quieter. Meanwhile, the agents continued to unravel the network. The data gathered from Carla Nunez, the motel liaison, confirmed at least 6 other properties used as safe houses. Bank deposits filtered through laundromats and discount furniture outlets showed over $4.1 million in unexplained cash flow over 18 months. One of the final leads came from a burner phone recovered from a trash bin outside the Las Vegas duplex. Forensics pulled a fragment of a deleted contact list. One number linked to a now disconnected prepaid line had called 7 known handlers within a 3-day window before each shipment. The number was last activated 2 days before Heriberto's arrest. It was his voice, if not in tone, then in digital fingerprint. But still, the man himself said nothing. In court, his presence was quiet. He wore simple jail-issued clothes, made no eye contact with the gallery. When asked to confirm his name, he responded only with a nod. Reporters grew impatient. Public curiosity began to fade. The man behind the biggest fentanyl bust in DEA history had no face, no words, no sound. And yet, inside every file folder, every pill container, every empty seat at a dinner table left behind by an overdose, his silence echoed. It wasn't a confession. It was control. A web too wide. For every thread, the DEA pulled 3 more unraveled. Heriberto Salazar Amaya may have been the mind at the center, but his network, his true legacy, was sprawling, adaptive, and frighteningly durable. Even with him in custody, the operation he designed continued to pulse beneath the surface, as if it had learned to survive without him. Federal prosecutors, now overwhelmed with the mountain of digital, physical, and testimonial evidence, began assembling the architecture of a case that was far larger than anyone anticipated. What started as a drug trafficking indictment evolved into a blueprint for a new kind of cartel, decentralized, technology-aware, and rooted deeply in American soil. It wasn't just the pills. Forensic accountants traced the movement of nearly $12 million through what appeared to be a legitimate portfolio of businesses. One of them, a pest control company in Utah, showed 0 customer reviews and 0 visible operations, but had filed quarterly taxes for 7 years. The IRS had never flagged it. Why would they? Everything looked normal on paper, but in reality it was one of at least 14 paper fronts Heriberto's people used to wash drug profits clean. A single transaction might involve 4 separate shell companies, 2 cryptocurrency conversions, and a final investment in real estate. One property, a storage facility near Portland, was valued at over $1.1 million and paid in full. Cash. Agents found that facility nearly empty. Just 2 folding chairs, a rusted file cabinet, and a wall calendar from 2021, and that perhaps was the most haunting part. The more they looked, the more they realized how many people had helped Heriberto's system survive without ever knowing his name. Landlords who rented storage space with no questions asked. Bank tellers who processed suspicious deposits with raised eyebrows but silent mouths. Contractors who installed hidden compartments in delivery vans, thinking it was just custom transport work. Drivers who moved packages for a few $100s, never checking what was inside. He didn't use soldiers. He used civilians. People living paycheck to paycheck. People who were grateful for cash jobs. People who believed what they were doing wasn't really illegal until it was. The prosecution team now faced an agonizing question: where did the network end? More than half of the 16 initial arrestees had flipped, some out of fear, some out of guilt, some because they knew they would never walk free unless they handed over something bigger. The leads kept coming. A small printing shop in Arizona that secretly produced pill press molds. a freight company in Nevada that smuggled packages inside spare tires, a courier ring in Colorado disguised as a moving service. It seemed endless. But the higher levels, those truly in command, remained elusive. Yes, Heriberto had engineered the U.S. operation, but the origin point, the supply that lay across the border, and while authorities had long suspected a link to the Sinaloa cartel, no solid evidence tied him directly to any top-level figure in Mexico. He never mentioned names, never accepted money from cartel accounts, never crossed the border once during the surveillance period. If he had connections, they were carefully protected, sealed behind layers of proxies and runners. One DEA agent described it bluntly. It's like chasing a shadow in a hall of mirrors, even in custody. Heriberto's silence served as a firewall. The network didn't collapse. It fragmented, disappeared. Some stash houses were emptied within hours of the arrests. Vehicles went missing. Rental leases were terminated. And several suspected lieutenants simply vanished burner phones, dead, no traces left behind. The court issued sealed indictments for 12 more individuals believed to be connected to the operation. But arrests were slow. Some had fled the country. Others had dissolved into cities lost among millions. And yet the human cost remained. The pills had made it out, not all of them, but enough. In the weeks following the bust, overdoses linked to counterfeit M30 tablets continued in places like Santa Fe, Boise, and Sacramento. One tragic case involved a 16-year-old girl who had taken half a pill at a party, believing it was prescription-grade oxycodone. She never woke up. Her family testified before a congressional hearing in May 2025, holding up a photo of the pill found in her room. It was a match. One pill, one life. Federal authorities faced mounting pressure. The press began to shift the narrative, not just about the bust, but about the failures leading up to it. How had Heriberto operated so long, so freely under the radar? Why hadn't financial institutions flagged the laundering sooner? Why had it taken so many deaths for anyone to listen? Even within the DEA, there was introspection. How many others like him were out there? How many ghosts operated in the gray zones between borders, identity, and bureaucracy? Heriberto didn't answer those questions. He didn't need to, because his silence had said enough. The wheels of American justice do not move swiftly, especially not when the case is national in scale, international in implication, and cloaked in silence. Heriberto Salazar Amaya, the man at the center of the largest fentanyl pill seizure in DEA history, still hasn't stood trial. More than a month since his arrest, he sits in pre-trial detention awaiting the first formal hearings that could take years to resolve. He's been charged with 12 federal counts: conspiracy to distribute a controlled substance possession with intent to distribute money laundering, use of firearms in furtherance of drug trafficking, illegal re-entry after deportation, each with decades of prison time attached. Some counts carry mandatory minimums of 10 years. Others life. And yet there he sits, still, quiet, no plea entered, no statements given. The United States Attorney's Office for the District of New Mexico filed a motion for pre-trial detention within 48 hours of his arrest, citing Heriberto's extraordinary flight risk, his undocumented status, and the breadth of the network he allegedly controlled. The judge agreed. No bail, no conditions. He would remain in federal custody alone in a high-security cell. But the legal machine isn't designed for immediacy. Even in high-profile cases like this one, federal courts are burdened by a maze of motions, procedural hearings, and discovery phases. Evidence must be presented to the defense. Witnesses must be protected. Languages translated. Paper trails authenticated. And with an operation this complex, every piece of evidence could be challenged. Heriberto's attorneys have already filed motions to suppress key parts of the investigation GPS tracking without warrants, the admissibility of statements made by co-defendants, the legality of DEA surveillance tactics. They've argued that Heriberto's identity was not properly confirmed at the time of arrest, hinting at procedural loopholes they may exploit. In short, the game has shifted from street corners and safe houses to courtrooms and depositions. Behind closed doors, the Justice Department is weighing its options. A trial could expose confidential sources, operational methods, and ongoing investigations into Mexican supply chains. There's pressure, political and public, to get a conviction, but there's also caution, because a trial of this magnitude is not just about punishing one man, it's about sending a message. Yet Heriberto's silence robs them of that theater. There's no testimony, no remorse, no plea deal. He has rejected all offers to cooperate. Prosecutors at one point hinted at reducing sentencing in exchange for the names of suppliers or upper-tier partners. He declined. No counteroffer, no negotiation. To the public, the silence is confusing, infuriating. This was supposed to be the moment of reckoning. The man behind millions of counterfeit pills, the silent architect of a deadly supply chain, was supposed to face his accusers. He was supposed to explain himself, to stand under the lights of the courtroom and be judged. But there he remains, quiet, unreadable still. In the absence of a trial date, journalists have turned to speculation. Profiles appear weekly, each claiming to reveal the real Heriberto. Was he cartel trained? A rogue operator? A logistics savant? An ideologue? Or simply an opportunist who knew how to fill a deadly market gap? No one really knows. Even his court-appointed attorney has been tight-lipped. One brief statement to the press simply read, "My client has not waived his rights. He intends to contest the charges. We will not try this case in the media." But the media is already doing it. Every headline is a reminder of what's at stake. The unchecked spread of fentanyl. The evolving methods of drug trafficking, the legal gray zones in enforcement. Politicians invoke Heriberto's name during press conferences, warning of other ghost networks still operating. Parents of overdose victims demand harsher laws. Advocacy groups question the government's response time. And beneath it all, Heriberto remains silent, not confessing, not defending, just waiting. Some believe it's part of a deeper strategy. That without words, there's no record to weaponize. That any admission, any flicker of weakness could be used against him or anyone he once worked with. Others think he's simply resigned, already building a life behind bars in his mind. Then there's a third theory, that Heriberto believes he will walk. Legal experts call it unlikely. The evidence is staggering. But trials aren't about certainty, they're about proof, about processes, about what can be shown, what was gathered lawfully, and what withstands scrutiny under constitutional law. If any part of the investigation was flawed, if any procedure violated rights, whole swaths of evidence could be tossed. It's happened before, in smaller cases, in larger ones. In one leaked email, a federal prosecutor warned, "We need this one to be airtight. If he walks, we'll be cleaning up bodies for years." But airtight takes time, and Heriberto knows that. Every day the trial is delayed, the story fades a little. Out of the headlines, out of the public's mind, until one day perhaps a plea deal is quietly accepted or a verdict is delivered behind closed doors. Or maybe nothing. Maybe Heriberto Salazar Amaya will spend the rest of his life behind bars, untried, unbroken, and unheard. And maybe that to him is victory. Lessons from 3 million pills. They were small. No bigger than the tip of a finger. Pale blue stamped M30. Some chipped at the edges, some still warm from the press. And they almost disappeared into the evidence vault, just more pills in an ocean of poison. But behind each one was a story. A bedroom floor, a funeral, a child's unanswered phone, a mother sitting in silence replaying a voicemail over and over, a police officer collapsing from accidental exposure during a search, an EMT holding his breath while reviving a 17-year-old who had no idea he wasn't taking real oxycodone. That's the true weight of those 3 million pills, not in grams, but in grief. This case, the largest fentanyl pill seizure in DEA history, wasn't just a victory. It was a mirror. One that reflected the failures of policy, the brutality of addiction, and the evolution of organized crime in the 21st century. Heriberto Salazar Amaya wasn't the first ghost to weaponize synthetic opioids, and he won't be the last. But he showed just how sophisticated the game has become. No longer about turf wars or flashy drug lords. Now it's about quiet men in motels, shell companies, cryptocurrency, drivers who don't know what they're carrying, families who don't know what their kids are taking. It's the silence that kills, and it's the silence that made Heriberto so dangerous. For law enforcement, the case is a study in precision: how to build a prosecution without a confession, how to unravel a network built entirely on fragments and fear. The DEA, FBI, U.S. Marshals, and local police forces work together like pieces of a single organism. Quiet coordination, relentless pressure, patient tracking. But even with Heriberto in custody, the war continues. Pills still cross the border. Labs still churn out synthetic poison. Social media platforms still sell lies to teenagers: just one pill, just once. Dealers still operate in shadows, emboldened by anonymity and demand. And more ghosts rise, watching how long the silence holds. There is no single fix, not for this, but there are lessons. Lesson 1. Networks don't always look like hierarchies. Sometimes they look like ecosystems, fluid, adaptive, feeding on everything around them. Lesson 2. A dealer doesn't need a gun to be deadly. Just access, just connections, just enough knowledge to stay one step ahead. Lesson 3. Justice is slow, and pain is faster. For every arrest, there are 10 new overdoses. For every pill seized, 100 more make it through. It's not a fair fight, but it's a necessary one. And finally, Lesson 4. Silence is never neutral. Whether it's the silence of a man refusing to speak, the silence of a system too slow to act, or the silence of a society looking the other way, it always has a cost. Somewhere in a storage facility, a child's soccer trophy sits on a shelf beside a shoebox filled with unused fentanyl pills. Somewhere in a courtroom, a prosecutor flips through evidence binders, wondering which document might be the crack in the defense. And somewhere behind thick prison walls, Heriberto Salazar Amaya waits. His lips sealed, his story unfinished. Because silence too is a form of power. And the story doesn't end just because one man is locked away. It ends when the pills stop coming, and that day hasn't arrived. In the stillness of prison light, Heriberto stares at a cinder block wall. No window, no sound, but his own breath. Outside, the world moves on. Court dockets fill. Evidence is catalogued. Families grieve. And he remains unspoken, unread, untouchable. The architect of silence. The dealer in shadows. The ghost that changed the game. Thank you for following this crime-solving journey. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the Crime Trail channel so you don't miss out on upcoming exciting stories.